to Biota.org Conversations. I'm Tom Barbalet, and today I have the pleasure of talking with Gerald de Jong, a returning guest to this podcast, and also Pedro Ferreira, a new contributor to this podcast series. Gerald, since we last spoke to you, there have been a number of developments with Darwin at Home. Could you fill in the podcast listeners with regards to this?
Yeah, I've been working on sort of congealing the ideas of how to make it, first of all, a system where the creatures encounter each other, but also somehow to integrate sensory activity as well as motor activity. So what I've done is I've gone basically back to where it all came from, the actual elastic interval that everything is based on. And I've sort of been thinking about ways to program the elastic interval itself so that it becomes a kind of a cell that during its lifetime differentiates into either muscular function, the way everything works right now, or sensory function, or perhaps even some sort of brain function. So the idea is that a cell has a number of ways to do what it wants to do. It has an ability to sense the environment. It also has the original ability of acting like a muscle, but everything it does costs something. So it costs what I'm calling life quanta. It probably sounds fairly familiar to you, Tom, in some way or other.
Most certainly, yes. In fact, I have a couple of questions just here. When we did the Biota.org interviews piece with you last year, we talked about the idea of there being reproductive cells as well, or reproductively specialized parts. Have you considered that in your most current model?
No, not reproductively specialized parts. I do have a number of what I consider to be sensible specializations, including one that sounds quite unusual, which is a fat muscle, or a fat cell.
Like a storage cell.
Yeah, like all it does is it stores, it stores life, basically, so it just sits there, and instead of doing something and spending, it just doesn't spend, it just saves. So that's an interesting specialization, but I don't see any need for reproductive, apparatus per se, because I don't think it adds anything to it. What I'm doing with respect to that is a coalition of these presumably differentiated cells working together will make up a body, and some of them are able to see, some of them are able to think, but they have to, for example, they have to rent memory space, so that will keep them economical on the amount of memory they use up, and they can also just become eyes or temporarily become eyes. So there's this whole flow of sort of life tokens that are flowing through them, and they can spend them as they see fit.
Terrific. Now, this also lends itself to there being a number of entities in a single environment. Is this what you're talking about as well?
Yeah, I'm going to put them all in one environment so that they can interact and have the survival of the fittest happening in a context like that, instead of the sort of more synthetic context that I've been doing the evolution so far. We were talking earlier about reproductive organs. The way I plan to do the replication idea, because there's no need to have, a womb or anything like that. What I'm going to do is make it so that they have to save up life points in order to, basically have permission to replicate. But replication is just something they can request from the world.
Fascinating. Now, in terms of time frames, what are you envisaging in terms of implementation, and when will this actually be available for users to download and tinker with?
I've been working really sort of hard on getting the specification down for how these things can be programmed, because that's really what it all comes down to. You have a sort of a programming model from the point of view of one individual cell, which in Darwin at Home is an elastic interval. And from its point of view, it can do a number of things. It can, for example, spend a lot of energy to peek into the environment and make an observation. It can also spend a little bit of energy adjusting its length, therefore becoming a muscle. It might also spend its energy storing data and thinking about what that data is, because it has to pay points, life points, in order to store for data. So that means it won't be able to play the role of a muscle as well. So they will have to specialize. And so you have a coalition of cells which make up a body, and it's the coalition that survives or doesn't.
Fascinating. Fascinating. Well, I look forward to future podcasts and continuous updates with regards to this development, Gerald. It sounds all very exciting. Now, Pedro, I got you involved in this podcast in particular because it's on open source, and whilst I've known and worked with you for a period of about a year, and you can give an introduction with regards to that, I wanted you to contribute particularly because you have worked with a number of open source projects, and you also have a broader sense of the philosophy of individual versus corporate in open source. Can you give some introduction to who you are and some background to that as well, please?
Okay. So I'm an informatics engineering student from Portugal. I'm currently finishing my degree. So I became interested in A life maybe 2 years ago or so, when I first took contact with artificial intelligence, and then I saw Noble Ape, and I got involved. So I've been involved in A life for approximately more than a year. So I got involved in Noble Ape primarily because it was an open source project. As a matter of fact, I looked it up in SourceForge. That's how I found it. So I believe that open source and Noble Ape is a living proof of that. Open source should act as a way of sharing knowledge, of providing knowledge to other people and help them solve their problems without reinventing the wheel. In the other hand, like you said before, there's the corporate open source phenomenon that appeared maybe 10 years ago, not so much, when big corporations started putting money in open source communities so that they could benefit from the open source development process and the user contributions.
So the topic for today is, how does open source benefit artificial life, or is open source good for artificial life fundamentally? And I need to point out, Gerald, your Darwin at Home is also open source. Gerald, what's your thinking with regards to open source and artificial life?
To me, artificial life is something that, if you develop a curiosity for it, there's just there's an endless domain to explore. And if you've got some pieces of code available that have already done a lot of the searching that you would probably end up doing yourself in the first while, if that's out there, I mean, it's just makes so much sense to have that spreading around. I the whole thing is about curiosity and satisfying curiosity. And you must probably agree that the code is what it's about. It's like there's a sort of a poetic element to it.
Certainly. I think, as Pedro has discussed, there are two components to open source. One is what the individual developers, I always think of them as kind of software engineers, but what the individual developers see in the source code. But there is also a corporate component to this as well, and this is something, in reflecting on this question, that I've thought about quite a bit, that the examples in artificial life that have been successful, and I'm thinking of potentially a future Spore with World Right, but all his existing Maxis products to date, even though we can debate whether they are actually artificial life or not, but more importantly, Steve Grand's Creatures, which is the kind of quintessential artificial life project, and got Steve Grand a wide variety of accolades, and certainly evangelized artificial life for a number of years. That was a closed source model as well. So it is a question about what open source gives to artificial life in terms of artificial life developers, but in terms of getting the message of artificial life out, is there a paradox where a certain amount of money and employees and things like that are actively needed, or is it something that an open source community can also flip? What's your thinking on this, Pedro?
Well, I believe an open source community can develop an artificial life project with without the minimum problem. It's okay, we must admit you need some background knowledge, you need some scientific knowledge, but once you have the primary tasks defined, and once you know what you want to do and how you're gonna do it, it's a matter of work. So you can gather people from a bit around the world and gather them and make them work together in order to make the product as they would do with other software, with any other software product. I believe that this question of open source versus closed source, okay, it's true that many of the artificial life products out there are many of the successful ones are closed source, but maybe they are not so scientifically acceptable as an academic project, an open source project would be. I don't know if you're getting me. It's just it's a matter of revealing how you're doing it and the scientific value of that knowledge you're using. So if you have a closed source project and you do not reveal at least how it works or the basis it uses to work, it has no scientific value because people will look to it as just another game. So I believe it's also a matter of value, and an open source community will produce documentation and will normally produce wikis and user documentation and code documentation, and that's a way of exposing the internals of the simulation and making it scientifically,
accessible.
Yeah, accessible, and people will be able to evaluate it and say, okay, this is a good idea, and this is biologically correct, and it resembles pretty much what happens in nature, or no, this is just garbage, and it works as a regular game.
Tom, can I ask you a question? Do you know what happened with Creatures? Did it ever become, or has it always been a great success, or has it never been a great success? Because I haven't seen it around except when I was in England some years ago. Did it survive? Is it a big thing still?
My understanding with Creatures when I was in the UK, it was a huge phenomenon in the UK, and my understanding, and certainly looking at the mailing lists associated with it, there was a huge user base at a particular time. What fascinates me about the Creatures phenomenon is that they addressed a lot of the concerns that Pedro had in terms of scientific credibility by actually using the money that they'd earned through creating Creatures in employing scientists. And these scientists went on to publish academic papers that they had produced from research that they had produced while they were at CyberLife. So what they used in some regard in order to address Pedro's concerns was to create a commercial product, obviously get funding initially for the creation of the commercial product, but turn that funding into employing scientists that then went on to publish papers and things like that. Now, I've not had any primary contact with Steve Grand. My only contact was with a fellow who I was interviewed with on BBC Radio 4, Ricardo Colasanti, and he had worked at CyberLife for, I don't know, a period of a few years at least, and told a number of stories about how Steve Grand had been highly successful initially in terms of getting in a brain trust, so to speak. Now, in terms of how Creatures has continued, there was an open source movement for a period of time to take, and this again is my own understanding, to take the papers that had been published academically and translate that to an open source model. When I came to investigate this probably about 4 years ago, because I was fascinated by the successes that the Creatures model had had. Steve Grand received an MBE from the Queen. I mean, in terms of accolades, Steve Grand, I think, is questionably, but still probably one of the best examples of successes in artificial life. And how that translated in a long-term sense, my understanding now is that Steve Grand talks almost exclusively on AI, but still has strong artificial life interests. And if Steve Grand or anyone who knows Steve Grand is listening to this podcast, I would love to have him on the podcast to ask him that question specifically. But I think the creatures model was successful in a kind of medium-term sense by translating some of the funding that Steve had received and some of the profits that he made into actively employing scientists. So whilst the source code remained closed, and in interviews that I've read of Steve and heard of Steve, he's always said it was because it was kind of hackery coding and he didn't want to kind of put that out to some kind of scrutiny. I remember reading that in one interview, although I can't reference sources. But it was an interesting model that he was able to take a corporate source model and address the initial concerns with regards to academic credibility, and extraordinarily successfully. I mean, if you look at New Scientist and all the mainstream science publications that covered his stuff, as well as the academic publications that they published in on creatures-related stuff, he was able to translate this very successfully in a medium-term context. Now, 10 years on, there are still mailing lists that persist. There is still a user group. I was subscribed to it for a period of time and viewed some of the interactions in terms of the user base. There are still people that are very passionate about creatures. It has a wiki, an active wiki that people still contribute to. So I don't know whether it was just a UK phenomenon. I don't know the background history with regards to the kind of long-term success. But in a short term and medium term, Steve Grand was very successful in translating initially funding and then profit back into producing something that had scientific credibility, or at least appeared to have scientific credibility for popular science purposes and scientific publication. Although obviously CyberLife is no longer a functioning entity, I think it is an interesting example of how artificial life can operate and be highly successful in a closed source model. So, does that answer your question, Gerald?
Yeah, that CyberLife no longer operates was more or less the question. It probably interesting that it went that way. Interesting also his reasons for staying closed source.
Well, I think it was a flip comment. I don't know necessarily whether that was
Tom, have you ever seen Nintendogs on the Nintendo DS?
No, I haven't, but I'm familiar with the phenomenon because I had some connection with Bandai, who produced the Tamagotchis. So I'm familiar with that as being a potential artificial life model. For the benefit of the podcast listeners, can you expand on that and some of your ideas about that?
Well, my daughter has one, so I've seen it operate, and I've seen her become quite attached to it. So it's just fascinating. I mean, when you see the sort of degree of realism they've managed to accomplish in the behaviors and the gestures and you know the timing on everything and the movements, and they've come a long way to obviously compellingly imitate the behavior of a puppy for a little kid.
Do you think this is a direction for proprietary or even open source artificial life?
Well, I'm sure. I mean, remember last time we talked a couple of weeks ago with Dave Kerr, he was talking about what his idea of it was, that we're making pets.
So in terms of the existing brain trust that is in open source artificial life, do you see any directions that could be taken either, well, with the stuff of any of the people that you've observed that could be taken in this direction?
In this direction, you mean in the sort of the commercial game sort of environment?
Andy Phelps is a good example of this because he has feet in many different communities, but his interest in artificial life is moving the brain trust that exists in artificial life currently into something that is highly commercially viable. And this is what's interesting, that we are, in some regard, in part of our simulated environments or whatever we're creating, there are pet-like elements, and this component could easily be extracted and then put into some API that a company like Nintendo may be very receptive to. What's your thinking in terms of the strategic movement for this, and how does open source benefit that?
If you look at one interesting thing about open source is when you look at which projects were the most hugely successful, it's the ones that are on the one hand they represent infrastructure, and on the other hand they are inherently pluggable. There are many things plug into them. There are a number of examples, like the Apache web server is probably the best example, or the Asterisk telephony server. These things are, they're made to be pluggable. And in the artificial life environment, you can imagine a similar sort of pluggability. And if that's accomplished, then you can you can imagine sort of being able to do all sorts of diverse experiments on the same foundation, and open source lends itself for that because it's inherently good at maintaining architecture. Infrastructure.
I do not believe at first that the pet phenomenon will be very helpful for artificial life. It's okay. It's a funny thing, and it's you see some of those pets are used as experiments for more serious things, but I don't see them as a big step for artificial life.
Pedro, you talked about the scientific value of artificial life. Could you mention a bit more about what you see as sort of the scientific value? What kind of artificial life elements are of interest in the scientific community?
I believe that in artificial life you've got maybe two different communities. You have those who believe in evolution after all, and you have the I believe it was discussed in the last podcast, is artificial life all about evolution? And you have other people who try to simulate human and animal behavior without that kind of evolutionary philosophy, but based on more abstract things like thought and more complex things. So it's very hard to say when a specific kind of knowledge is valuable or not. But when you're working on stuff that even in real biology and real life you do not know how it works, like the human mind, like the behavior of even the behavior of a simple animal, it's maybe it's too much speculation trying to simulate that behavior based in purely mathematical expressions, in any kind of expression that you find that you believe that fits that behavior. So it's kind of hard to define what's scientifically valuable.
This is another part of the reason that I got Pedro involved in this podcast. We got a lot of positive feedback from the last podcast, and I think the series is going to continue just on the momentum of the first podcast in some regard. But the feedback that I got from Pedro, which is really what I was trying to caveat in the last podcast, although I was rather tired, was the idea that there are a number of phenomena that exist in the real world which are attached to life other than evolution, which also come through in artificial life development. And certainly my own experimentation, as I said in the last podcast, evolution was a kind of secondary component that wasn't explicitly programmed initially, but did come through long-term simulation. But what interests me in artificial life was things like communication, ideas of community, the bioids example perfectly, that you get flocking behavior through these kind of implicit communications that occur. I mean, these kind of ideas. So my thought with artificial life, particularly in the context of what it is, that there are so many different components that make it up. Now, a number of these components are actually highly relevant to contemporary both science and social science. What interests me in interviewing Paul Johnson in particular was here you have a political scientist that is using swarm modelling methods in order to solve fundamentally political science problems. The movement between, particularly in things like psychology and sociology, but the movement between group characteristics and what is the mind and the fringes of biology, and I have friends that are computational biologists that do delve into this area as well, although they won't call themselves artificial life folk. And there are applied components, and this returning to Rick Colasanti, having been interviewed on BBC4 with Rick Colasanti, who had worked at CyberLife, he came back to me and he said, what you have here is exactly what I'm looking for in terms of visualization, in terms of all these other components that are highly useful to my research. And this is the feedback that I've gotten from real living, breathing scientists with regards to Noble Ape, that there are a number of components which are useful for what they're doing in terms of visualization and in terms of things like AI and how that motivates, ripping out the ape's brain and putting in their own AI models. There are so many Venns here. And some of these Venns are actually respected sciences. But another question that I wanted to put out is the idea that bricks and mortar science, and this comes into open source as well, bricks and mortar science is very useful for things like funding, for respectability, for all these kind of secondary things that really we touch on when we talk about open source as well, the things that are difficult in open source, because obviously there's a corporate model of open source which is fundamentally about, well, I don't want to say use and abuse, but like that. And if there is a bricks and mortar idea of what science is faculties, it's buildings, it's institutions, it's a cash flow, it's funding. So there are just so many directions to this.
Would it be possible to have some sort of idea of what branches of science are interesting in artificial life? What you just said was almost surprising for me, because you described the sort of the value of the sociological modeling that goes on. That was sort of a surprise to me. But I'm just curious if you think there are branches of science that would be, most would consider artificial life to be most relevant, besides from AI, of course, which is sort of a no-brainer.
People immediately associate artificial life with biology. I think there is some overlap with various aspects of biochemistry and physics as well. I think there are some aspects, as we've said, with regards to psychology, sociology, even political science. Interviewing Paul Johnson was fascinating because, as you asserted, I too was very surprised that people are actively using artificial life models in the social sciences in these kind of ways. There's, in fact, a history of it. It's not just Paul Johnson. There are a number of people that have used Swarm in particular in order to get real-world, mapping onto theoretical world data out from artificial life. So I don't like limiting my thinking anymore in terms of what artificial life is useful for, in terms of where it maps into the sciences and the social sciences. But what I don't like doing is constraining it currently in terms of saying it's about this thing, it's about biology, it's about, something that comes purely through AI. Really, it's more a philosophy that people actively assert. So it's this idea that there are a group that don't say that they're artificial life. We all do, fundamentally, I think, by using the term artificial life, have a somewhat idealistic view about what it is. And what I find curious in the sciences in particular is the people that don't want to be doing artificial life.
They don't? Okay, so which disciplines don't want to use it?
So I'm in fact reversing your question there, Gerald.
Well, I can imagine in physics that you might not be, able to do much with a hypothesis in an artificial life scenario.
But they are physical environments.
They're pseudo-physical.
Okay, exactly. No, they're simulated physical environments, and this is what interests me in terms. We'll bring in Bruce Damer in a while, because he simulates lunar and Martian environments. And these kind of environments, to put artificial life in there in the context of robotics or in the context of could humans survive there, can we send chimpanzees up there? I mean, there are these kind of contexts as well, which I find fascinating in terms of really asking the question, what isn't artificial life? And in terms of physics, okay, so it's not explicitly artificial life, but artificial life in a simulated environment, the simulated environment component actually can lead back into physics.
Lead back into a hypothesis that you can propose. I mean, it's because it's sort of. I can't quite imagine, using something like Noble Ape or something like Darwin at Home for, doing neutrino studies or something.
Certainly, obviously, well, physics is a huge discipline, as all these. I mean, biology too. I mean, there are obviously components of biology that don't vent into artificial life at all. Maybe there is applied component. Maybe what we are actually talking about here is that in the applied parts of all these sciences, there is a Venn component that goes into artificial life through the simulation component of artificial life.
Well, I believe the artificial life case is somewhat similar to the bioinformatics case. That now everybody uses the bioinformatics term for defining a broad set of processes and techniques, but in the past you had you know genetic engineering and computational genetics, and you know it's not you cannot. Okay, I'll bring here once again the question of the definition of a life. I don't know if you can define a life as a science like you can do with physics and mathematics, because a life, like you said, just grabs small bits of other sciences and melts them together in order to simulate and to produce environments. But it's pretty like the bioinformatics case. You have genetics, you have DNA sequencing, and you have biochemistry. And some people will say, okay, I'm not working on bioinformatics, I'm working on biochemistry or DNA sequencing. But according to some definitions, they're working actually in bioinformatics without knowing that. So I believe the same happens with a life, because both grab some knowledge from different fields of the scientific spectrum. It's not a pure fusion between physics and biology or something like that. But no, you have elements of physics, biology, mathematics, AI, so many things. So you cannot define it in a particular way.
This idea of a life as being parasitic science, I think, is fascinating. But the informatics example, the bioinformatics example, is interesting because my understanding of the history of it is that it formed itself as a thing of respect through substantial corporate funding. That it, in fact, in its fledgling stages, was a series of ideas that were very quickly capitalized on in a research context, very heavily funded, and this ultimately justified its existence within a number of universities. As artificial life, in terms of its academic and open source context, there is always this problem with regards to funding and validity through money and these kind of things. Well, unfortunately, in the nature of podcasting, Gerald has to leave us currently, and we are picking up Bruce Damer, the founder of Biota.org, as well, to continue the discussion with open source. Gerald, do you have any concluding comments on open source and the directions of artificial life in that context?
Well, I think what we've got to do is we've got to look at the idea of pluggability. I'm sure Bruce would agree on this, that to create a sort of an environment that that allows people to plug in their ideas and save themselves, reinventing wheels, then we will have accomplished something.
And any final thoughts with regards to Darwin at home until we next discuss this?
Final thoughts? Well, there's more to come. There's a number of things I still have to describe. I'd like to recommend that people go listen to the latest podcast, because it's I explain it all, and I'm continuing on. It's starting to get more fun, because I think it's really interesting to explore the idea of a situation where only coalitions survive.
So, Bruce, welcome to the podcast. For people not familiar with your work since we last spoke, what has gone on in digital space, and where are things currently?
Well, digital space has done pretty much almost all aspects of simulation of NASA's new space architecture, which would be returning to the moon robotically and then followed by crewed missions. And we're even working on things surrounding asteroids. And so we've done real-time 3D design simulations of these missions so that the internal NASA people can iterate their ideas for how to return to the moon or go to asteroids or just extend human reach into the solar system.
Now, we touched on a little earlier the idea of simulating artificial life in space and the kind of stuff that you were doing with digital space on lunar and Martian environments and creating artificial life environments on those terrains, on those environments. What is your thinking on that in terms of maintaining everything open source and getting all that working together?
Well, the interesting thing is we've seen we've all seen for the last 10 or 15 years is that unlike the web, now for instance, you can look in the 70s and 80s. In the 70s and 80s, there was a million document formats, HTML document formats for publishing systems, for PCs, for Macs, for Unix workstations. And then completely unexpectedly came this great thing, the web, which was very, very simple architecture. And there was a pressing economic need to move those documents or somehow represent them on the web. And that created this glue mechanism that created a standard. Now we see XML coming into the web, and then it poured itself now into Microsoft Office, and everybody's using XML. So effectively, we've kind of a previously stovepiped environment, which was 2D documents, got moved into much more of an integrative common environment. But with 3D in the 90s, as we've all seen, these stovepipes are very narrow. They're one engine for one massive multiplayer game platform, one little simple 3D scene graph for an A-Life experimental platform, and then, as we've seen with Digital Space, we do our platform to do robotics on the moon, and that's very specific and does these good things. But is it of interest to a multiplayer game company? No, it isn't. On the other hand, we see perhaps Second Life is kind of possibly the Microsoft Word of 3D. If they're going to really say, we're open sourcing our client, they're not open sourcing their grid or their server yet, but they're saying that because we want to establish a de facto standard for getting at multi-user 3D space, and we have the user base. Maybe they're making this play for becoming the Microsoft Word, which is on every platform. It's really too soon to say. The return on investment, sort of the investment return you get from doing 3D is a lot lower than from writing documents. You write a document, it's an invoice, you get paid. If you write a bunch of content for an open source 3D plugin or 3D client, it goes into the general pool of the community, and it's cool and it's neat, but does it give you a return and drive your need to do more and more 3D? So it's hard to say. So I guess, prior to going up to Linden Labs on February 8th and sitting down and talking to them about how the open source could impact the Biota efforts or vice versa, getting some Biota experiments going on inside Second Life, one has to consider, is Second Life going to be around, going to be acquired, etc.? Does the open sourcing of the client guarantee their presence into the future?
The stuff that you've done so far with Digital Space, if you wanted to put an artificial life simulation using the moon as the simulation environment, is Digital Space the place to go to? Is the fact that you already have a lunar simulation, you already have some physics associated with the dust and things like that? Is that the starting point, or do you think there is another approach?
If you wanted to create a whole lot of creepy crawly creatures, kind of like Carl Sims, physics-based creatures, and evolve good climbers for the moon or good rovers for the moon, you really wouldn't need. You could easily do it in Digital Spaces. There's a full Python API so that one could use Python script to talk to the platform. There's a full C++ plugin architecture, the whole bit. And not only that, as time goes by, we get higher and higher fidelity simulations of what the lunar surface really is like. So evolving good robots for the moon through an A-Life mechanism, yep, we're it. Evolving fun A-Life creatures like growing plants and run barking dogs and running cats, you probably need to have a multi-user environment with people who are stimulating or otherwise selecting out the cool plants and the cool creatures. You would need something like Second Life that has users in it and a lot of rich content.
Now, you've raised a couple of issues, and I can feel Pedro chapping at the bit with regards to the ideas of individuals contributing in an open source environment versus the corporate open source model, which obviously Linden Labs is starting in terms of opening their client, but we've also seen with regards to companies like IBM, Hewlett-Packard, Apple, where they have a corporate component and an open source component that reaches out to the open source community. Pedro, in terms of this idea of the individual versus the corporation in this kind of open source contribution, you're a historian in this regard. You have a good background in terms of understanding these issues. Can you kind of summarize them for the podcast?
You mean the issues between individual open source and corporate-based open source?
Well, as an individual open source developer going to the Second Life client, the kind of issues that you have in terms of your time contribution, your energy, and how this is used in a corporate context. Can you give some discussion to that?
So I'm a great supporter of open source, and I find it great that the guys in Linden Labs have released the source code for the client. I feel that there's still some support lacking, regarding they still don't have a true open source community. I believe it's also a matter of time, and so I cannot tell you now if it would be rewarding to take part in the Second Life open source effort, because you still do not have any guarantee that your work will be useful, or your work will be used for the community's benefit and not only for Second Life's benefit in this case. So I believe that first there must be a strong community, some open source projects related to the game itself, perhaps some integrations between existing projects and Second Life, so that a regular user base can be built, and then yes, probably you will have people working on it, developing it. But for now, you have one guarantee at least. You have the code there; it's licensed under GPL, so whatever they do in the future, you may fork the client.
Now, there's an interesting point here that may be missed for people not familiar with open source development, that it isn't just a matter of putting source code online under an open source license. There needs to be almost a contract with the community. PBS did a documentary called Code Rush in the late 90s on the releasing of Mozilla. And the interesting thing that Netscape did in the releasing of Mozilla was that they contracted in people that were part of the open source community to actively communicate what the open source community would get out of the launch of Mozilla. And I think when you're talking about the wait and see with regards to Linden Labs, this is the disconnect that is being missed. It is not just a matter of putting the source online, releasing it open source, and putting out a press release. There is a component, and I believe this is what Linden Labs will do in the near future. I believe this is what Bruce is alluding to with regards to his visit to Linden Labs. But it's a matter of also coming back to the open source community and saying, if you contribute this component that improves our graphics engine, this will actually be of a group benefit for all folk creating avatar-based universes in the future.
If we go back to a very interesting episode where I believe AOL created the community source license for Netscape initially, the Mozilla browser, something like that.
AOL, I believe, acquired Netscape after the release of the Mozilla browser. So what happened was Mozilla was converted, whilst we're not privy to whether or not Netscape and AOL were in communication. The Mozilla development was done prior to the acquisition by AOL.
There was some tension, I know, initially in the community source license, and I think eventually it was changed just to GPL, or maybe even LGPL. And then Sun had a kind of has been moving toward sort of community licensing for Java for years, and there's been tension, say, between a big corporate user like IBM and Sun over the control of the standard and then the users. So, in a sense, when you have this appendage of an open source community effort attached to a corporation which has investors, it does have a finite lifespan to be able to operate in this way. you have a different situation than when you have say a university group that kind of goes on under its own steam, and its investors are its grants and its professors, or you have a small firm like ours where we have no investors other than our grants, but we don't have a pressing need, a pressing market need that's short term. So I'm just curious as to see, when I was at Linden Labs the last time, I said, you guys have to understand that regardless of how many users you have and how much land that they own, how many linden bucks they own, ultimately you have to reach a break even so that your business is taking in as much cash as it needs, and you don't have to keep going for rounds of capital. If you're continuing to go for rounds of capital, you ultimately run out of that. Communities.com, which is one of the 1990s avatar companies, was up to round K, I believe, before the investors finally pulled the plug on it. So you have to. I think we have to see it in the business context. That's what I'm saying, really, the open source. And so people who are wanting to put a big investment, say, into Linden Labs client and make cool things happen, have to understand that if one day the investors pull the plug on the grid or pull the plug on Linden Labs and the grid goes down, then your client really isn't really worth anything, your client investment, if the servers are no longer supported. It's very expensive to maintain those servers. And that kind of thing couldn't be taken on by a volunteer group. It's just too costly.
There seem to be a number of metrics, Bruce. There's, in one sense, the size of the user base. Another sense, there's the potential size or need of maintenance that you've described. And then the third is actually the size of Linden Labs itself relative to a company like Netscape or Apple or IBM or the companies that maintain long-term open source projects and interface with the community. But when you went to Linden Labs, you mentioned that there are about 60 people that work at Linden Labs full-time, and the open source effort, the sense that I get looking at the community, is probably maybe half a dozen developers at most on their end. That requires a different kind of model than the model that we've discussed with regards to Mozilla and Netscape. What is your thinking, and this is really a secondary to tertiary kind of interpolation, but what is your thinking in terms of Linden Labs' medium-term strategy? I've read online the CEO saying that he was going to release the server open source once they've fixed up some of the security issues. But do you think there is a medium-term play with regards to putting as much online open source as possible? And the second part of that question is, when you release something with a GPL, it develops a life in and of itself. It's not something that can then be taken away from the community once it's been given to the community. So what was your thinking in terms of Linden Labs' strategy, both with regards to medium-term strategy of releasing the server and also the connotations of releasing things under the GPL?
I was rather surprised, to tell you the truth, by their announcement, because they've recently had people basically writing bots and hacking the environment. And to my mind, you have to do a huge amount of thinking about creating a safe environment for an open client to prevent people from creating an enormous hack that will bring down your entire network. And I know the kind of pressure these guys are under. If you talk to Corey Ondraka, I mean, he's the technology chief up there. I mean, they're going through the same growth pains that YouTube was going through, where they're having to re-architect as they get more and more simultaneous connections and bigger grid. I mean, they've done a good job on the architecture, but the last client that I downloaded yesterday, Second Life client, freezes. It freezes not only itself, but my entire Windows system has to be hard restarted if I walk a few meters. So, in some sense, the open, I'm not really quite sure that they're really ready for an open source to handle the complexities of the user community creating forks in the code and potentially somebody creating a hack. And I'm not sure. I don't understand the timing. To my mind, if you pull back a little bit, efforts like Croquet 3D, which started in HP and is now at a university, I think that an effort to do an open source sort of metaverse, if you will, is probably best housed in a not-for-profit. One of the concepts we've had for years is the Contact Consortium, which was established in 1995 and is the parent organization even of Biota, could be sort of recast as a not-for-profit home for an open source shared 3D world. One of the concepts I've had is dumping the digital space open source system into that effort. But it would seem to me that if you had very much like the Linux community with Linus Torvalds, if you had a committee of people working under an open source standards framework, people are elected to the positions, maybe they have a very small salary, but there's many members of the consortium, and that consortium probably has a better chance of making it long term and making something that meets all the needs. Given the caveat is there, you need to have, a handful of people are willing to go at it for 10 years, relatively low compensation, but really passionately go at it. People who are very politically savvy and socially savvy to keep a community like that together, and technically savvy, like the Linux community has gotten. That really, to my mind, that's the best bet. I don't see an organization like that out there right now. The open source volunteer efforts seem to come and go within about a 2-year period, is about the lifetime of one of those. So, but I think back to Linden Labs, I'm sorry for going on and on here, but Linden Labs, again, what is its business model? If it open sources its client and its server and then experiences the complexity and potential hacks, it's not really going to be a very good thing for investors to see. So I'll leave it at that. I just really don't quite understand it at this point.
Well, that was my discussion with regards to the metrics of both the people internally within Linden Labs maintaining it versus the community versus the user base, basically, that this is a kind of three-dimensional metric that just doesn't seem right in my thinking either. Returning to the question at hand, in the prior recorded part of the podcast, we discussed briefly Steve Grand in terms of being the other model with CyberLife, in terms of getting initial investment, creating a product, making money from that product, bringing in scientists, publishing papers, and supporting a community through a non-open source model. What's your thinking? Because I know you spent some time with Steve. What's your thinking with regards to the CyberLife model, and do you think there is some benefit in that model that we are not seeing with an open source model?
Definitely. I think that it's both. It was very, very impressive what Steve did and the product that resulted. I mean, his thinking. He was definitely not a hard-nosed business type. The product was built. It had a lifetime. It had a window where it had a user base, and it was probably quite profitable. And then I think Creatures 2 came out, and by that point it was already on the declining curve, as most game platforms go on these curves. You can maybe have a 2-hump curve sometimes with the second release, but ultimately users jump on to other things and they don't stay around. So at the end, I think the split of Steve from CyberLife, from the company, was not pleasant, and he wasn't able to obtain, I don't believe he's able to obtain the rights to continue the work on the original platform, and perhaps he didn't want to. Perhaps he was burned out on it. I probably would be. So in a sense, the culture of the big-brained person like Steve Grand, the personal culture, the personalities, perhaps didn't mesh over time, and Steve was unable to continue the work. But on the other hand, it produced something that was beautifully crafted, was a good experience for users, and had a lifetime. I think if we look at something that's coming up this year, look at Spore by Will Wright. Now that's going to be, I think, the greatest test of this approach, which is the commercial platform, but fairly open, but crafted as a game so that it is financially self-sustaining in some way. Maybe there's a subscription model for Spore. But Spore is going to really teach us a lot. If Will Wright can make it work and have Spore go on for years and keep evolving and keep people interested. If he can't do it, no one can.
I think Spore is an interesting example because one of the interesting things about Cyberlife was Steve Grand's ability to bring in scientists, hard-nosed scientists that would write papers, work with him, and then produce published papers. I think the model of contemporary game development is actually what bit Steve in the long run. And what interests me with Spore is that it's very much, contemporary game development is very much the Hollywood model. The idea of version software really goes against contemporary game development. The big contrast to that, obviously, is World of Warcraft. Pedro, what is your thinking in terms of, is there any potential to marry the benefits of open source with the benefits of bringing in cash with proprietary software? Do you see any marrying of those two ideas?
You mean bringing cash to open source?
The Second Life model, in some regard, is based on there being a corporate component that collects money. World of Warcraft is another good example, although it's all closed. And then you have an open source component that develops and improves the interface. Do you think, firstly, there's the subscription model, which is what Bruce alluded to briefly with the Spore example. There is the single purchase model, which is the Steve Grand example. Can you see that there is a good symbiotic hybridization? I guess Linux is another good example. People actually pay money for Linux. They get it both through investment and through people paying money for it. Can you see artificial life moving into this kind of culture?
I do not believe money has anything to do with open source. You have paid open source, you have free open source, free as in beer. So I don't see any problem in paying for a service now. You know, it's. I believe what's happening with software. I believe we are experiencing with software what happened in the past with real world. I mean, physical products, services to emerge, and now you buy a car and you get a bunch of services attached to it, and so I believe the same thing is happening with software, and I believe it's going to be even more revolutionary in software, because with all this stuff of open source and free software and people sharing software, companies will at last understand that they won't be making profit from software itself, but from services attached to that software, and that's what big corporations are now starting to do.
But returning to the car analogy, I have a few questions about the analogies. I think what you've described is the free as in beer metaphor for open source. The problem with contemporary open source, and certainly artificial life open source, is that there is a component which is free as in absolutely no money. And it's not a situation where you are buying a car, because there is no initial money up front. All you are doing is getting the labour part of the service for nothing. And this is the breakdown that corporations, corporate communities operate on money. That's their reality. That's what they drive. That's what drives them. It's actually dollar amount. So you can't say there is nothing about money in open source, because corporations that use open source are saving money. That's what they're doing. They're getting value for no money. So the service metaphor, how does that work out in your own thinking?
No, I believe you misunderstood my point. I wasn't saying that there's no money in open source. I was saying that, you know, there's the fact of a product being open source has nothing to do with actual money. You can buy an open source product. You can buy Linux, like you said. There are paid Linux distributions. So I don't believe that money has anything to do with it.
But for a corporation like IBM, if they were to engineer Linux, it would cost them money. If they were to pay engineers to create Linux, it would cost them money. So the fact that there is this thing called Linux that is effectively free for them initially means that they're not paying engineers money, which means basically they get all this stuff for nothing, which they can then charge money for. So somewhere there this is the value disconnect with regards to open source. Somewhere there, something that a large community has put a lot of effort in pulling together is then worth something. So where does this value come in? For a corporation, where does this value come in the open source model? And returning to the artificial life question, the metaphor of the free as in beer does not work with artificial life open source because, to my knowledge, there are no artificial life open source projects bar perhaps Framsticks, where there is an academic component as well, where the artificial life developers are actually making money from it being a service. So the metaphor for open source in artificial life needs to be very careful. You can't use the operating system analogy, but similarly the operating system analogy is also problematic because corporations treat open source like it's a product. For them it is just money that they're saving. So how does this broad open source methodology resolve itself with regards to artificial life in your thinking?
It works in a life as it works everywhere else. You could start an open source A-Life product now and just have a monthly subscription and have services attached to it. I don't see any problem in it. It's just product as it would be with any other software product. It's okay. You need the scientific knowledge. You need to invest money on it. And I believe that in the field you have the example that Bruce provided a while ago of the non-profit organizations. You know, IBM does that with Eclipse. You have Eclipse. It's not being development is done by a strict team, a restricted team, and then you have people contributing from all around the world, like, you know, in the main open source philosophy. But all the investment comes from the Eclipse Foundation, which is financed by IBM and primarily. So I believe that open source could follow that way too. You could have a non-profit organization like Biota, for instance. You could get some investors, you know, buy a bunch of servers and start making your business out of it. It's like any other project.
So what's your thinking on this, Bruce?
What you've got is several things going on. You've got a gradation of platforms. You've got to sort of use a sliding scale. You can say you could use the Multiverse Network virtual world. That's a commercial platform you could use, which doesn't charge anything upfront for their SDK. So you can develop an A-Life environment there, and only when you start to sell it, you start to pay for them. So that's kind of the code is kind of free, because if you're never charging for it, you can still use it, even though you don't control the code, down to fully open source, where you're kind of dependent, like we are. We're dependent on the developers of Ogre 3D, Open Dynamic Engine, and all the other components that we've put together. And if any one of those goes away, we have to make a big investment to change something or fix something. It's been good so far, but it's a lot of labor. We could have bought Unreal Tournament or Unreal 3 or Unreal 4, but we would have had to pay several $100,000. But we've got a world-class environment, which we could have developed all our NASA applications in. But because we don't have access to code, if we needed something very specific for NASA, we'd be at a stopping point. So in a sense, all of this is going to keep shifting. You're going to have the open source components come back in 5 years. There will be different and stronger open source components. There will be, commercial game engines or investor-backed game engines and 3D engines and 3D protocols will be better. They'll always be just certainly ahead of open source components. And really what it comes down to is if you keep looking at that, you'll always be wondering what to do. Whereas I think what A-Life needs is, and goes back to the VRML days, and people who are listening to the podcast may remember the virtual reality modeling language. It was a cool technology in search of applications. And no matter what they did, no matter that the fact that they may have open sourced a VRML browser for the web, that they may have had investor-backed VRML companies like InterVista, or they had a large corporate entity called Silicon Graphics Inc. that put a lot of money and backed the standard. They had all that, but they didn't have enough of a market, even in terms of grants in academia or a commercial market, to sustain the effort, and it all kind of collapsed. So in a sense, even if you're completely open source, if you don't have sort of a pressing need that people have, when Linus Torvalds developed Linux, he kind of must have felt that, hey, a Linux running on a standard 386 machine, giving you the full Unix capabilities, but on a PC has got to be useful for somebody. And that's what drove Linux for years, the fact that, hey, it was like, why buy an expensive Unix workstation when I can just put this thing and get all the same services on a clone PC that I can build myself? And so the A-Life movement, or the Biota efforts, actually have to generate something that creates a population of passionate users and passionate developers. And if we use a commercial platform, we may get a better feature set and we may get better support. If we use an open source platform, we may get a cost savings and maybe more longevity. But really, it's irrelevant until we find a compelling application to generate that population of passionate users.
I've been in correspondence with John Klein over the past week. In the last podcast, I mentioned to Gerald briefly at the conclusion of the podcast that he should look into John Klein's Brevet environment, and John and I have been bouncing back ideas over the past week in terms of what the needed interface will be for this kind of shared artificial life environment, which really touches on your discussions as well, Bruce, in terms of digital space. So I think as a community we can come together on some kind of idea of a shared environment. But it's then, and this was what I found fascinating with your analysis, Bruce, a matter of getting the people involved, getting the user base involved, things like that. Does open source implicitly have a user base that comes with it, and is the proprietary model with advertising and these kind of additional things that bring more people in, with people that are actively professional PR people, these kind of things? I mean, I see these two methods being in opposition in terms of how they actually get folk involved. There's the term in the US that I use frequently called AstroTurf. And what it is it's a perception of a grassroots movement that has been completely paid for and created. And looking around, and I've thought about this quite recently with regards to the kind of broader aims of Biota, there is so much AstroTurf out there, in the US market at least, that it's very difficult to kind of put my little grass stalk a little bit above the created AstroTurf in order to get the message of Biota out. There are companies, and this recently bit Dave Kerr. Dave Kerr was talking last podcast about being a part of a project in Canada which was supposed to get independent game development, and it appears what happened instead was a whole lot of existing American, French and Canadian games companies created little breakaway teams. So they actually got commercial game developers out there to get this public funding, and completely defeated the whole purpose. I see, in terms of getting a user base together for any kind of shared artificial life environment, it's critical, and this comes back to things like Will Wright's Spore, for there to be a way to get the users actively involved. And things like Spore do not feed back into the broader artificial life community unless Will Wright changes the way that he's been speaking about Spore to date. So I'm thinking, on one side, open source, and this is what I found with Noble Ape, this is why I'm talking to you currently, Pedro, is about basically getting a grassroots community together. It's about communicating with people and not having this kind of AstroTurf metaphor where you pay, PR companies and try to create this grassroots community. But at the same, I see that there is just a problem between these two methods that I've tried to allude to in my discussion. What's your thinking in those terms?
I believe that open source eventually will get through it. It's true that it's very hard to get a community, and very hard to base a project on your effort and your a small user base but people are beginning to understand that in the end, open source and free software and all the FLOSS efforts are for public benefit, and even governments and government agencies are around the world are starting to use open source, and it's kind of getting some good publicity. I believe that okay, it will be difficult. You're fighting against corporations. You're fighting against people who have advertising and have guys working for them to make their marketing. But well, it's a matter of ideas. You have great things out there that were born of nothing. Were just nice ideas. You know, Google, for instance, it was a student project. It's not it didn't start as a giant corporation as it is now. It's okay. It's not open source. It's not the same thing. But I believe that above all, independently of the development and the business model you choose, if you have a good idea and you have a good project, you'll eventually get a way of supporting it, and you'll eventually get a big community. And that's what matters now in the web, in the internet in general.
It's not that there isn't a case where occasionally good ideas, organic ideas, do percolate. The problem is that there is so much bad noise, basically, that getting it to that critical level where you are rising above the bad noise is the problem. I think this is what Bruce was alluding to in terms of the ideas of a user base. Bruce, in the world of AstroTurf, what is your thinking in terms of motivating an organic user base towards artificial life?
Getting the user population up?
Yes.
There's a couple ways of thinking about it. One could, for instance, go into something like Second Life or World of Warcraft if it has an open API, and put in the brains. Say, for instance, take Noble Ape, take the brains from Noble Ape and the brains and guts, and make it and try it out in a multi-user space, and that already has a population, and see who shows up and kicks the tires. So effectively, you're bringing artificial life, or you're bringing Biota to platforms. You're bringing techniques like L-system plants, like Noble Apes, other things, and you're saying, well, we'll bring these techniques to any platform that comes up, but we'll evolve them over time. So if Second Life goes away and there's something else, you pack your bags and you pack your genetic codes, and you go in and instance them in another platform. And so you're evolving your technique in the platforms as they rise and fall, which is the current pattern of all multi-user spaces, is the rise and fall of user populations. So you're effectively saying, follow the populations, don't worry about the platforms, but develop your techniques through time. The other way, of course, is to create, I think, either tag yourself on like Jeffrey Ventrella did for a while, or like several of us have done, is connect to an investor-funded, open, not necessarily open source environment, get a brain trust together and create a really cool world like Creatures, and that'll go for a while, and then will disappear. But you get a chance to perfect techniques. The third approach, and those commercial ventures may or may not be successful either. The third approach is to get a brain trust together and make a really cool environment that is multi-user but has some cool kind of lifelike metaphors in it, and see who will come. So I think that really those, and hope that you don't run out of energy before enough users show up that donate to your shareware bank account, that you lose interest. So I really think that those are the three possible pathways.
I think if there's anything that is shared in the artificial life experience, it is this idea of patience as a developer. It's the idea that you really are developing in not even a medium term, but a very long term context. In that metaphor, it seems that all this is very possible. returning to the Jeffrey Ventrella example, I find him fascinating in my correspondence with him because he has not put any of his stuff open source so far. Yet he has a strong following. He's, I think, the only artificial life link that is still active on Richard Dawkins' site. And he's been able to move his ideas and development into something which has maintained over a long period of time without being open source. So there is this kind of giving away the software but keeping the source code. What is your thinking on that model, Bruce? And then also I'll ask Pedro the same question.
It's almost as though if you look at the one example that really jumps out at me is when I was at the Santa Fe Institute visiting in the summer of 1994. Basically, I was in Chris Langton's Swarm Lab, and they had just gotten Mosaic to run on their local Sun workstations. And one of the first sites I went to was a page by Carl Sims at Thinking Machines site where they downloaded the MPEGs to play his blocky swimming creatures. And for me, that was a sort of a moment of epiphany because I said, here they are. You know, the potential marriage of the internet, of a big internet space and potential evolving creatures, even though all we were seeing was an MPEG, but it was a suggestion that it was going to happen one day in a virtual world online, probably, and I thought with users. But it turns out was already by 1994, those evolving blocky creatures were already extinct. Connection machines were no longer being sold or even serviced, I think, by that point. And that site was about to go down a couple of years later completely and go offline. And so, but what was left was publications by Carl that had enough detail on how those creatures were created that other people could create the blocking evolving creatures. And you can see them in the Metaverse tool set. You can see them in Carl Sims' work of about 5 years ago.
They're in Breve too.
And Breve. So effectively, you know, the original creatures are now fossils, but what was important was the publication of the methodologies. And so, for instance, if, you know, maybe Steve Grand has published more, Chris Winter may have published more about this, but the creatures' brains, and it's certainly Polyworld, the fact that it was published. So even if Jeffrey Ventrella doesn't want to put Darwin Pond up on complete open source, if there's a publication of here's what I did, here's my algorithms, here's my experience, take it from here, that probably, for Biota as an organization, maybe what I'm coming to here is if we can collect meaningful publications that guide future experimentation and give as full a background and methodology as possible, that may be one of the best ways of moving artificial life and Biota forward, even if we're not even talking about source code, just a collection of good publications.
So we've been able to bring things full circle. I think this is probably a good point to conclude the formal part of the podcast. Pedro, you're heading to Switzerland.
I'm doing my internship at CERN. I'm heading to there. I'm going there. I'll start working at the beginning of March, and I'll be working on an open source project called Indico, which is an information system for conference handling and conference media storage and stuff like that. I believe it will be for sure a great experience to be at CERN. It's a great place, and there's a great scientific community there, and now there's all these hype around the LHC, the new particle accelerator, and I believe it's going to be great.
Bruce, exciting times for digital space.
Well, I'm actually embarking this year on a multi-country lecture tour starting next Friday at Modesto Junior College here in the Central Valley in California, and then following, it's kind of our out-of-town tryout, and then at Industrial Light and Magic on February 8th, where I'm doing a talk for all the Lucas companies in their auditorium on basically the birth of the virtual worlds medium, how it compares with other media like the early cinema, early film, the phases of development of the virtual world medium, and then talking about how it's a tremendously and powerful industrial technology, for things like design engineering, like we're doing with NASA, because they're very interested in the space stuff, and talking about Biota, talking about how does this new medium of shared virtual spaces that are populated, how does it actually tie into evolution and future of life on Earth? And this is where the Biota vision will come in. If it becomes a space where life can express itself in evolutionary terms, it's a very big step for the planet. So I'll leave off on that kind of philosophical note, but this tour will go to 4 countries in Europe and then continue to many, many institutions after that. What this is all leading up to is the launch of the Virtual Worlds Timeline project, which you can see the mission statement at vwtimeline.org. And that's an attempt to produce a public wiki with a graphical timeline that anyone can upload historic elements, such as, say, the story of Darwin Pond, or the story of Active Worlds, or Second Life, or Maze War from the 70s, and stuff like that, so that there will be a place to go to say, how does this virtual worlds medium, where did it come from, who did what when, how do things tie together, what about papers about Carl Sims' blocky creatures, what about growing, having creatures inside cyberspace, because this is a very ephemeral medium and things are lost quickly. As we know, if the individual passes away, then you're really losing most of their archive of their work in some cases. So this is a sort of a multi-pronged strategy to say, let's create an archive, sort of an Alexandrian library of the virtual worlds medium, and include the Biota vision in there.
If you would like to participate in biota.org conversations, contact me, tom@noble8.com. Any feedback, any comments, any ideas for future podcasts? That email address again, tom@noble8.com. Thank you very much for listening to this podcast. Look forward to you tuning into the next podcast.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening.